Since their introduction to Lorwyn block in 2007, Planeswalkers have been a major part of Magic the Gathering in casual and competitive play. However, not every Planeswalker has lived up to even the most basic expectations of viability. While we will be looking at the worst Planeswalkers, we will specifically be referring to mythic rare Planeswalkers. There have been both uncommon and rare Planeswalkers, but those are both more recent and far less common, and by default are generally less powerful than mythic rare Planeswalkers. We will also be excluding Planeswalkers printed in introduction decks, given that they were purposely designed to be unplayable in constructed formats and only really used by new players. Every other Planeswalker, however, is fair game for consideration. So starting us off at number 10, we have Sarkhan the Mad. This Planeswalker enters with 7 loyalty and costs 3 generic, 1 black, and 1 red mana. While most Planeswalkers have abilities that increase their loyalty counters, Sarkhan the Mad has no abilities that raises loyalty. One of his abilities does cost 0 loyalty, reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. However, Sarkhan the Mad deals damage to himself equal to that card's mana value. So while that ability doesn't technically cost loyalty, if you reveal a spell to high enough mana value, Sarkhan could even die to its own ability. His -2 ability targets a creature and forces its controller to sacrifice it. Then the player creates a 5 power and toughness dragon token. Sarkhan's -4 ability causes each dragon creature you control to deal damage equal to its power to target player. None of these abilities are terrible, but without any way to rise Sarkhan's loyalty, they hardly have much time to provide use. The ability to make dragons can only be used a single time if you wish to use it alongside the -4 ability. This means to get any real value out of the -4 ability, your deck already needs to be running some number of dragons. But there are much stronger dragon-focused Planeswalkers that don't die so quickly and easily. Because even beyond Sarkhan lowering his own loyalty count, the opponent is still free to attack Sarkhan, making it even less likely you'll get any long-term use out of his abilities. The only reason Sarkhan isn't high on this list is that at the very least he was designed to be this way, with his card reflecting his fractured sanity. Beyond that, his abilities are at least good. The problem comes to the fact that he does not get to stay around very long to use them. Some Planeswalkers on this list have abilities that aren't even good at all, so at least Sarkhan the Mad has some worth using, at least for as long as you can. As such, he's only bad enough for the 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Dovin, Grand Arbiter. This Planeswalker costs 1 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue mana, and enters with 3 loyalty. Its first ability adds 1 loyalty and has the effect that, until the end of turn, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put a loyalty counter on Dovin, Grand Arbiter. This ability can be used to increase Dovin's loyalty fairly quickly, but does require you to have multiple creatures able to connect to really benefit from it. Dovin's second ability removes 1 loyalty in exchange for creating a Thopter token with 1 power and toughness, and also gains you 1 life. These tokens do have flying, which makes them unblockable by creatures without flying or reach, which means the Thopter tokens Dovin generates in theory can help gain loyalty with Dovin's first ability. His final ability costs 7 loyalty and allows the player to look at the top 10 cards of the library, put 3 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. This effect is a stronger version of Dig Through Time and able to dig fairly deep for whatever cards you need in a given scenario. However, usually these final ultimate abilities in Planeswalkers are expected to end the game, or put you vastly ahead. And while going up 3 cards is good, it's not worth the time commitment Dovin takes to get there. Generally speaking, in competitive play, a Planeswalker's ultimate is their least important ability. A Planeswalker could potentially be killed before you ever untap with it on board, so the abilities you can activate as soon as it comes down need to have some impact. The first ability does nothing at all besides potentially give Dovin more counters if you're already ahead on board space. While the minus ability is good, it leaves Dovin at 2 loyalty, which means you'll often be forced to use the Thopter as a chump blocker to save Dovin from an opponent's attack and not use it on the next turn. While Dovin's final ability is certainly tempting, the rest of the card makes it pretty lackluster overall. Coming in at number 8, we have Ajani Goldmane. Originally printed in Lorwyn, Ajani was one of the first 5 Planeswalkers printed. He costs 2 generic and 2 white mana and enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty. His first ability adds 1 loyalty and gains you 2 life. As we saw with Dovin, a life gain on a Planeswalker ability is usually incidental, a bonus effect alongside the main effect. While gaining life is not a bad effect, casting Ajani for 4 mana just to not even get a full healing salve is not up to rate. Ajani's second ability removes 1 loyalty and puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance until the end of turn, which means attacking does not cause them to tap. This ability does allow you to be more aggressive and leave back blockers to protect Ajani, but it also is a protection that requires you to already have creatures. And then his ultimate ability costs 6 loyalty and creates an avatar token whose power and toughness are equal to your life total. This essentially creates a Sarah avatar token that could potentially be quite big. However, it lacks any form of protection or evasion, meaning your opponent is free to block it at will with small creatures until finding a way to kill it. Sarah Avatar as a card is fairly underwhelming, and it can even shuffle itself back to the library after being sent to the graveyard. This token on the other hand not only lacks that, but can be permanently removed just by being bounced back to your hand. This Ajani does very little on its own, and if you do manage for it to survive long enough to use its final ability, it only just produces a single large creature token. Ajani being one of the earliest Planeswalkers does spare it from being higher on this list, since there was no existing design space for Planeswalkers to compare to at the time. As such, Ajani wound up being somewhat underwhelming as the first white Planeswalker and the 8th card on this list. And at number 7, we have Yangling Sky Dancer. This Planeswalker costs 1 generic and 2 blue mana and enters with 2 loyalty, which is rather low even for a Planeswalker with a low mana value. Her first ability adds 2 loyalty counters and makes one target creature lose 2 power and flying until the end of turn. This ability is not great, although it adding 2 loyalty does somewhat offset the low starting loyalty. Her second ability costs 3 loyalty and generates an elemental bird token with 4 power and toughness as well as flying. This cost means that Yangling is one of the few Planeswalkers who can only activate one of her abilities the turn she enters the battlefield, since she only has 2 loyalty to spend and only 1 ability that adds any loyalty. This means Yangling must use her rather lackluster plus ability on the first turn and hope she survives. And even then, if she does survive, it has now taken 2 turns to make a 4/4 flying creature. Her final ability costs 8 loyalty and gives you an emblem. Emblems are static abilities tied to the player that cannot be removed. This emblem has the effect of giving each island you control the ability to be tapped to draw a card. While this is a rather strong effect in the late game, it's very difficult to actually get there. The quickest one can activate the ability is after 3 turns of using the +2 ability, and this is assuming the opponent has no ways of harming or destroying Yangling outright. A Planeswalker needs to be impactful as soon as possible, and while in best case scenarios Yangling does have the room to have a great deal of impact, that's only if she's given the time she needs to get there. If she had enough starting loyalty to make a token as she entered and threaten that ultimate ability quicker, she might have seen at least some play. Instead, we have a Planeswalker unable to do much of anything at all, at least on the first turn of play. At the very least, 2 of her abilities are somewhat decent. It's more her loyalty numbers and costs coupled with a bad first ability that holds her back. As such, she's quite bad, but not quite as bad as the cards ahead her on this list that are even more lacking in redeeming qualities. And at number 6, we have Huatli Radiant Champion. Huatli enters with 3 loyalty counters and costs 2 generic, 1 green, and 1 white mana. Her first ability adds 1 loyalty as cost, but then adds 1 loyalty counter for each creature you control. This is a better ability than Dovin's similar +1, seeing as how you don't need to have creatures to attack to get the extra loyalty. Her -1 ability, however, doesn't even provide her any basic protection like Dovin's, seeing as how all it does is give you target creature extra power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control until the end of the turn. While this can make for one rather large attacker, that creature loses the benefits at each of the turn, and thus cannot be used to help protect Huatli. Beyond that, if you don't have any creatures on the battlefield at all, Huatli's first 2 abilities essentially do nothing beyond add or remove a single loyalty counter. Her first 2 abilities require you to already be decently ahead to accomplish anything. Even if you have some creatures, if you don't have a high number, then her abilities, although functional, are still fairly low impact. And her final ability, which costs 8 loyalty, gives you an emblem that makes it so whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. The emblem's effect is good, but requires far too much effort to get there if you aren't already very ahead. And if you are ahead on board, then the card draw is less important as just outright ending the game, especially since similar effects exist on other cards. Meaning, for the same mana value you could cast Beast Whisperer and essentially have the same effect as Huatli's emblem. If her emblem were easier to get, or if she had abilities that worked without already having an established board state, she might have been more playable. But instead, she's a Planeswalker that asks for you to have a lot of creatures whose biggest payoff is being able to draw into more cards after already playing all those creatures. And at number 5, we have Nissa Revane. This Planeswalker costs 2 generic and 2 green mana and has a starting off loyalty of 2. Starting that low was a point against a 3 mana value Planeswalker, and is even worse for a Planeswalker that cost 4. She does slightly offset this by having 2 abilities that add 1 loyalty. Her first one searches your library for a card named Nissa's Chosen and puts it onto the battlefield. Nissa's Chosen has 2 power, 3 toughness, and whenever it would be put into the graveyard from the battlefield, it's put on the bottom of its owner's library instead. The idea here is that Nissa can keep bringing back the creature over and over, and while she can do that, the simple fact is that taking up even 1 slot in your deck for Nissa's Chosen isn't very good. Especially since you're most likely going to need to run multiple copies since Nissa Revane cannot search your hand for the card. If you draw your only copy of Nissa's Chosen, or if all of them get discarded or milled to the graveyard, this ability essentially does nothing. Many Planeswalkers make creature tokens as part of their ability, and if Nissa made a 2 power, 3 toughness elf token with the ability, it'd be much better. Instead, you now have to play copies of bad cards in your deck that, while only costing 2 green to cast, is a card you'd never want to cast in competitive Magic. Her other plus ability gains you 2 life for each elf you control. While it has a higher ceiling than Ajani, who's just getting you 2 life, it has a lower floor. If you have no elves at all, she can't even give you the 2 life with this ability. Finally, her last ability costs 7 loyalty and searches your library for any number of elf creature cards and puts them onto the battlefield. While this is rather powerful, the fact that she starts with 2 loyalty means you have to spend at least 5 turns of using her rather bad abilities, just in the hopes of eventually getting to her ultimate. The best one can really do with Nissa is stall for time by bringing back Nissa's Chosen to block and hope your opponent lacks the needed pressure to remove her. And at number 4, we have Jace the Living Guildpact. With a cost of 2 generic and 2 blue mana, Jace enters the battlefield with 5 loyalty, a fairly high number for a 4 mana value planeswalker. Its first ability adds 1 loyalty counter to look at the top 2 cards of your library and put 1 of them into the graveyard. While at first glance this might seem like familiar card selection, this ability notably doesn't add any cards to your hand. If you look at the top 2 cards and both cards are bad for the current situation, the best you could do is put 1 in the graveyard and then know you're going to draw the other. The strength of effects like this is being able to churn through the less relevant cards and dig deeper through the deck. While this does technically dig, it's essentially milling 1 card with a bit of extra information. The next ability costs 3 loyalty and bounces another non-land permanent back to its owner's hand. The strongest Jace card of all time, Jace the Mind Sculptor, has a similar ability that can only return a creature to its owner's hand. In exchange for being more narrow, it only costs a single loyalty, which is far more reasonable than 3 that Living Guildpact requires. Many planeswalkers have hard removal at a cost of only 2 or 3 loyalty, yet Jace, the Living Guildpact, has to spend that much just to put the card back in someone's hand for them to just recast it. Finally, his last ability costs 8 loyalty and shuffles each player's hand and graveyard into the library. Then, only you get to draw 7 cards. This inverted time twister effect leaves all of your opponents with no cards in hand and you with a full grip of 7 cards. While this is powerful, it doesn't directly win the game and does leave your opponent a chance to mount a comeback. This is especially true since everything on the battlefield remains, meaning if your opponent was ahead on board, they still are after you use the ability. This Jace only really manages to be an overtly lesser version of a similar planeswalker, with little to no reason why you would be running instead of Mind Sculptor beyond budget concerns. With abilities that either don't do enough or cost far too much loyalty, Jace the Living Guildpact both fall short compared to the other cards, but also in a vacuum. And at number 3, we have Chandra Ablaze. This planeswalker costs 4 generic and 2 red mana and enters with 5 loyalty. Her first ability adds 1 loyalty and then asks you to discard a card. If it was a red card discarded this way, Chandra Ablaze does 4 damage to any target. It's rare that a loyalty ability actively asks for other resources from a player, especially asking them to discard a card. Usually if this happens, it's because a planeswalker is going to draw a card or 2 to replace it. In this case, Chandra Ablaze takes a card and in turn might do damage. If Chandra discards a land or a colorless spell or anything beyond a red spell, the ability essentially is just discarding a card with no benefit. This is the only way that Chandra gains loyalty naturally too, meaning to eventually use her ultimate ability or even just to keep her around longer, you have to start pitching cards. Her -2 causes each player to discard their hand and draw 3. If you've already emptied your hand or your opponent has far fewer cards than you do, this can be a fairly useful ability. However, this type of ability has been done better on other Chandra cards, such as Chandra Flamecaller, making it a one-sided effect that will always draw you 1 more card than the number you discarded and doesn't even reduce Chandra's loyalty. Finally, Chandra Ablaze's final ability costs 7 loyalty and allows you to cast any number of red instants and sorceries from your graveyard while paying their mana costs. While this can potentially end a game, it requires a great deal of setup. While the idea was clearly that her first 2 abilities help fill your graveyard for her to eventually all reuse, in practice this is very clearly telegraphed and an opponent will know to kill your Chandra before she even gets close to using that ability. And if you do get to that point, this means your deck has been built around running as many red instants and sorceries as possible. But generally, those red, aggressive Spellslinger decks don't run cards with mana values as high as Chandra Ablaze. While Chandra Ablaze has a clear game plan in mind and none of her abilities actively work against it, it's just that her game plan is both fragile to disruption and requires you to go down in card advantage just to attempt it. As such, she's an easy pick for 3rd on this list. And at number 2, we have Gideon, Champion of Justice. He enters with 4 loyalty counters and costs 2 generic and 2 white mana. His first ability adds 1 loyalty and then adds an additional loyalty counter for each creature target opponent controls. While Huatli's similar ability was bad, Gideon's is arguably worse since it relies on your opponent to be playing a deck with creatures. If up against a control deck, it's extremely unlikely this ability would do much of anything since your opponent will most likely have very little, if any, creatures. This is also Gideon's only way of gaining loyalty, since his next ability costs 0 loyalty. Until end of turn, it makes Gideon, Champion of Justice, a human soldier creature with power and toughness equal to the number of loyalty counters. He's also indestructible until the end of turn, which means he can't be destroyed and all damage is prevented until the end of the turn as well. While he's still a planeswalker, this ability allows him to be used as an attacking creature. This ability isn't terrible, but it's also one that most Gideon cards have a variant of. Gideon Alent of Zendikar can become an indestructible creature as well, but that ability adds a loyalty instead of being neutral. Finally, Gideon Champion of Justice has an ability that costs a staggering 15 loyalty. It exiles all other permanents, including lands, leaving just himself on the battlefield. However, getting there is fairly difficult, since the only way of adding loyalty to Gideon naturally is by hoping your opponent has a high volume of creatures. And if your opponent does have strong creatures on board, they're likely going to be attacking and working on killing you the time it takes for you to eventually get up to the required total 15. And even then, for all of that, you're left with no lands, and Gideon likely has very little loyalty left, meaning he can't even attack for much damage while all players are rebuilding. It's much better to just use a conventional board wipe to answer a problematic board than hoping that Gideon might eventually do so for you. Gideon is slow and clunky and generally outclassed by similar cards in every way. But there remains one Planeswalker so infamous and so unplayable, it manages to top everything before it on this list. And finally, at number 1, we have none other than Tibalt the Fiend-Blooded. Tibalt costs 2 red mana, making him the lowest value mana Planeswalker. He also starts at 2 loyalty in an attempt to balance this out. His first ability adds 1 loyalty and draws you a card, but then makes you discard a card at random. If not for the random element, this would be at least a passable effect. But since the discard is random, the most vital card in your hand could get discarded without you being able to stop it. Random discards is often used against players to force them to potentially lose an important card. With Tibalt, you're actively forced to choose losing your most relevant cards in hand in exchange for 1 loyalty. Tibalt can even discard the new card he's drawn you before even giving you a chance to use it. This ability is made all the worse of the fact that his next ability costs 4 loyalty. This means you'll have to use Tibalt's terrible +1 ability at least twice before you get a chance to use Tibalt's next ability, and doing so as early as possible would kill Tibalt in the process. And all this for an ability that deals damage to a target player equal to the number of cards in their hand. This means if your opponent has no cards in hand, which is generally what you hope for in a game of Magic, this ability does absolutely nothing for the cost of 4 loyalty. Finally, his last ability costs 6 loyalty and allows you to gain control of all creatures, untap them, and give them all haste until the end of turn. This is essentially a free insurrection, although against certain decks, it will also do very little, if not outright nothing. Tibalt's ultimate can only be consistently useful in the commander format where there are multiple people to take the creatures of. But in one-on-one games against many decks, Tibalt's strongest ability does absolutely nothing. With 1 ability that's actively bad, and then 2 abilities that situationally can often do literally nothing, there's no question as if Tibalt deserves the top spot on this list. Since his printing, he's been infamous in the Magic community as a running joke and one of the worst cards ever printed. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other worst Planeswalkers you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.